Start in just a minute. It looks like we don't have as many people as we have chairs, so if you want to move forward and come join us, that's great. If you like it back there, I understand. And can everyone hear me okay? We'll try to use the microphone. Welcome to Show Me the Money, an overview of Chesapeake Bay appropriations. My name's Joshua Sachs. I work for the National Wildlife Federation. I am their Capitol Hill liaison for all things water. And prior to working for National Wildlife Federation, I did the same for Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So I've chased Chesapeake approps for a little bit. To my left is Mike Burke. Mike is the projects director for Senator Cardin. We're very happy to have him here today. If you don't know Mike, or you don't know what a projects director is, we'll remedy all that before the end of today. Mike, prior to being with Senator Cardin, has been with some house offices, was a school teacher, has done all sorts of things. He can give you his bio later if you'd like. But we're going to try to have a pretty informal discussion today. I was told when they were organizing this conference that there was a huge interest in appropriations. Maybe they were just trying to blow smoke to get me to come here and prepare a PowerPoint. Who knows? But we're thrilled to have all of you here because, as you know, appropriations are vital to protecting and improving the water quality in the Chesapeake Bay. And in this Congress, more than ever, we're gonna have a hard time. We're gonna be under siege, so we're gonna need the advocacy community more than ever to look for increases or to hold the line at worst. So today we're gonna use a few slides, but not too many. We're gonna organize our discussion like this. We'll start with an overview of the process. For anyone who doesn't know, nuts and bolts, how it works, and we'll define some terms. And then we'll talk about what appropriations specifically impact the Chesapeake Bay. And then we'll look ahead to the 112th Congress. And finally, we'll talk about sort of the role advocates can play in this process. The reason I tell you right now how we're going to structure this is we want this to be a dialogue. We don't want to talk at you for an hour. So we'll stop at the end of each of these and open it up for any questions you might have. I'll invite Mike to chime in whenever he wants while I'm talking, and I may do the same to him, but I'll try not to. So let's start with just sort of what is the process. But before we do that, I want everyone to understand that the federal government pays for many of these things, and there are several ways that the federal government outlays money. Some money is mandatory spending that just goes out the door no matter what. A bill need not be passed every year to have it go out the door. A lot of our entitlements work that way, like Medicare and Medicaid and things like that. There are other things that pass in bills that are mandatory spending bills, not authorization bills, things like the Farm Bill and the Transportation Bill. When those bills are passed every 5 years or 6 years, they set spending levels, and that money goes out the door every year unless Congress chooses to stop the money. But if nothing's done, that money just flows out. So those types of funding do not fall into appropriations, except for certain unique circumstances, and we can get into some of those later. But I want everyone to understand that what we're talking about today is just a certain pot of money that the federal government pushes out every year, and that pot of money needs to be gotten every single year. We need to pass appropriations bills every year that set those funding levels. So first, I want everyone to understand that when we talk about getting appropriations from the federal government, we're talking about a very small part of the total budget pie. So the piece that's sort of up there, the 20% that's floating on its own, that's what we're dealing with. Everything else, we can't touch it all. And then out of that 20%, we're going to talk about everything the federal government spends money on. So that's not just environment things, that's everything. So that's the bridge to nowhere, that's school funding, you name it. And we get a very small portion of that. So the reason I say this is so everyone understands we're fighting for scraps here, and everybody wants a piece, and there's not very much to go around, even though 3.6 trillion seems like a lot when you start. just to show you a little bit more, when we start subdividing that 20%, you can see, 6% goes to environment, energy, and science. And of that 6%, even less is going to go to the Chesapeake Bay, of course. We'll pull some from transportation and a few other things, but the point here is this pot gets smaller and smaller and smaller as we drill down. So, yeah.
Just a quick question: the military, does the Army Corps of Engineers count military?
No, the Army Corps of Engineers counts as discretionary spending through the energy and water appropriations. So, we'll talk a little bit about process first, and then we'll get into sort of how things really work. But every year, Congress is supposed to pass 12 appropriations bills. You see there a list of all the bills. I stupidly decided to make the bills that are relevant to us blue, because I thought that was the color of water and that would be cute, but the blue looks a lot like black when you put it up there. Live and learn. But of these 12 bills, there are 5 that impact Chesapeake Bay and water restoration. They are the Ag Appropriations Bill, the Commerce, Justice, and Science Bill, Energy and Water, Financial Services, and Interior and Environment. The Appropriations Committees in both House and Senate have a subcommittee for each of these, and each one is supposed to pass its own bill every single year. Here's how the whole process works. The first Monday in February, is it first Monday? The first Monday in February, by the first Monday in February, the President delivers his budget request to the Congress. That is a detailed budget that says, we should give this much money to this project or this much money to this issue area. It's not just the top budget number. Congress then takes that, looks at it, and then decides how much money they will put into the federal budget that year. And the Budget Committee of Congress passes a budget resolution that says, we will spend $3.8 trillion this year. Actually, this year it's probably going to be less. Once that happens, once we have the overall number, then the committee subdivides that, and they say, of the overall number we're going to spend in the federal budget this year, we will allocate this much to this committee and this much to this committee. Then the committees go about doing their work. So the House and the Senate work on slightly different timelines, but this is sort of how it happens. First, people come to their members. This is a role that you will all play, hopefully, in the future, and say, dear Congressman, dear Senator, this is really important to me. You need to fund it. Hopefully, they listen. There are forms that need to be filled out by advocates. We'll talk more about that later. Once all those are in, the offices get together and they determine what are the things they will actually work for. And there's a deadline where their requests need to be into the appropriations committees. Those requests then are given to the relevant subcommittee, who try to balance all the requests from all the different members of Congress. And they put together a bill. Once their bill is put together, the subcommittee will have a hearing and vote on it, then the full committee will have a hearing and vote on it, and ultimately the bill should go to the House floor and be passed by late May, so it can be final by the time the next budget year happens. Unfortunately, this schedule rarely ever is abided by. The House, I'll show you a Senate timeline also. You'll see the Senate timeline is pretty much the same, although a little bit behind. There are 2 reasons for that. The first is senators talk a lot. The second reason is that, per the Constitution, the House is supposed to initiate the budget process. They are supposed to pass bills first. The way it worked for a long time was the House would create a appropriations bill and a report. A report is an attachment to the bill that has more detail. They would send it over to the Senate, who would then amend it. For a few years, and ending in about 2007, if I remember correctly, the Senate decided not to wait and was working its own bills on a parallel track. I think the plan now is to go back to waiting for the House to initiate the bill, but we'll have to wait and see. I don't know if you've heard different.
To be determined.
Yeah, there will be a lot of to be determineds here today, unfortunately. So that's sort of the process. Does anyone have any questions about how that works? Just the general passage of a bill. Everyone knows Civics 101, right? Okay. Once the bills have passed each house individually, it's supposed to go to a conference. Conference bills have to be done by September 30th, as I said, for the start of the new fiscal year. If they're not, we'll pass a continuing resolution. Basically says we're going to stay with our existing funding levels for a week, a day, 6 months, a year, who knows, as long as they want to kick the can down the road. What that does is it freezes our spending at the last year level. It gives us no increases. That's problematic for people. Well, I guess it could be problematic depending on whether or not a cut is coming your way or an increase is coming your way. As it says here, in recent years, we haven't been able to finalize this and get it done in time. In fact, there are only 3 years in the last 20 where we've been able to pass the bills without combining them into an omnibus, and 1997 is the last time Congress passed the bills on time and actually got it done. So this is how everything works, and before we go on, we just want to sort of define a few terms. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, what's the reason that they bundled them into the omnibus? It sounds like that just makes it more complicated.
Well, the reason we bundle bills into an omnibus is twofold. One, it's a timing issue. If you bundle it into an omnibus, you can deal with one bill instead of having to bring 12 bills to the House or Senate floor. Another reason you do an omnibus, not just for appropriations, for everything, is the more things you put together, the more interests you can appease, and the more reasons people have to vote for it. So ultimately, an omnibus just becomes an easier way to pass a bill.
And is omnibus is there a technical definition of that, or it's just a bill that does a bunch of stuff?
Yeah, a bill that does a bunch of stuff is a pretty good definition. And as we go on, you'll see there are other, so this year we talked about a cromnibus, which is a combination of a CR and an omnibus. And there are all different ways we can sort of carve this up. Sometimes we'll get an omnibus for 6 of the bills, and then we'll pass the other ones on their own. Some years we are sure to pass the defense bill on its own, and then we bundle everything else. That's sort of how it works. So before I pass the mic to Mike and have him talk to you a little bit about specific Chesapeake Bay appropriations and tell you what a project director is and how you should get Senator Cardin to give you billions of dollars, I just want to cover a few things, and I wanted to ask the room here is, what is an earmark? Do people here know? We're curious to hear how you would define an earmark. Anyone want to try? Give it a whirl.
Our congressman earmarks a money for Greenway on the flood control project.
Yeah.
He got put it in last minute.
But we hear this term all the time in the news. Do people understand what earmark means? And the reason I ask is, I thought if you were going to answer, it seems like you're not, that's okay. We would probably get a few different answers, because truth of the matter is, earmark is an amorphous term. So, and also a term that has gotten a lot of bad press these days. So let's cover earmark for a second. Right now, an earmark generally means an appropriation that benefits a specific area or interest that is not part of the president's budget request. If the president has requested it, it's not an earmark. There's another way we can make a regional or specific funding item not an earmark, and that's by authorizing a program. I'm sure you all know that in the last Congress, Senator Cardin worked hard to reauthorize the Chesapeake Bay program. That authorization guarantees that this will not be an earmark. It's an authorized federal program instead. Because earmarks have been under siege so much lately, it's a good thing to avoid them as much as possible. That said, earmarks are great. I love them. I hope you all love them as well. I was at a meeting with Congressman Ruppersberger from Maryland recently, and he asked a room, what do you think of earmarks? And everyone started doing this and getting kind of nervous, and I jumped up and said, Congressman, we love them, we'd like some more. And he got an ear-to-ear grin and did this weird thing and said, that's where we are. And the congressman really got that. So the idea here isn't that everyone opposes earmarks, they don't, and I want everyone to understand that they really are a good thing. So I'm going to pass over to Mike now. He will tell you about our programs and our earmarks. Mike, over to slide 4.
Great. Actually, I think I'm going to, the room's small enough, I think I'll stand up and just check with you from there. So, out of all the slides that Josh showed you, only the first 3 of them are accurate. All the rest of them are wrong for varying degrees. You know, it's because he's trying to stick to civics, and you know, we're the Senate, we don't do civics. Here's the real lay of the land currently. There's a lot that's broken with the legislative branch of government right now, and the appropriations process is one of the victims of that right now. So what we, I think, are looking at is, Josh indicated that there is there's a budget act that the Congress is supposed to follow, that the House is supposed to start its appropriations process by certain dates, supposed to pass bills by certain dates, the Senate is supposed to act by certain dates, and so on. And none of that happens, and what's the consequence? There isn't any. You know, I mean, it's not like you get sent to the principal's office, right? So there is and there has been an effort to try to stick to those deadlines that were in the Budget Act, which was a reform because the budget process had broken down so badly back in, I want to say, 78, maybe a little bit later than that, that they did the Budget Act. So anyway, so that got an effort to try to reinstill some kind of normalcy to the appropriations process annually. As I said, that system is pretty much broken down now too. Additionally, do you remember anybody follow the food safety bill that went through the Congress here the last couple of months? Huge bill, very important for all Americans. You know, there's a lot of provisions in there where you know, people are surprised to learn that the Food and Drug Administration didn't have the authority to require a food company to do a recall on you know, product that was problematic in any way. They didn't before the Food Safety Act got enacted. And there were not inspectors enough to go around, and there was a whole lot of pieces of the food system in the United States that was really totally dysfunctional. The food school lunch programs in the United States were largely based on what do we do with the excess commodities that our farmers grow? How do we get rid of all that extra cheese and you know, corn? Well, we give it to our kids, just like the cattle. So there was a real effort to try to change what's in the school lunch programs, nutrition, so on. All great stuff. House did it, Senate did it, back and forth. Senate sent it over to the House for final consideration, and the bill crashed and burned. And does anybody know why? The House was willing to go along with all the provisions that were in it, but what was the problem? Anybody know?
The Constitution.
Yeah, because it was an S bill. It was a bill that had a Senate initiation to it that was starting it over. And it had a revenue provision in it. And as Josh says, according to the Constitution, all revenue bills have to start in the House. So it had to be an HR, and it wasn't an HR, and therefore the House determined that under their rules that one of these provisions that was in there was a fee on the industry to help pay for some of the provisions of the bill constituted a revenue measure, and therefore it was unconstitutional. So they had to go back at the very end of the Congress, get another bill, another HR bill, exact same text, and end up passing that through to get the president's signature. It's just one example of the ways in which the process has sort of gone off the rails here. In terms of appropriations, we are operating now under the third continuing resolution for the fiscal year that began on October 1st. It takes us out through March 4th. After March 4th, anybody's guess kind of what's going to happen. Are we just going to continue to spend at the same level that we did for this past year? That's technically what a continuing resolution would typically do. Are there going to be changes in it? Are there going to be significant changes to it? Are there going to be, we're just not going to do the continuing resolution anymore. We're going to have a whole new omnibus appropriations bill for the remainder of FY11 that will take us out through the end of September. It's unclear. My sense is we'll probably end up doing a CR, or sort of a modified version of a CR out through the end of the year. That's bad news for the environment in a bunch of ways, because there's going to be cuts across the board in a lot of these programs, and as Josh has said, environment, energy, and science together accounts for less than 2.5% of the federal government spending. So that's going to get cut even further. And I think what it means also is that there will not be any of Josh's beloved earmarks in the FY11 bill at all. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think so. And as we look towards what happens with FY12, that budget process that's supposed to be getting underway on first week in February, what are we going to do about earmarks? Well, some members have managed to denigrate earmarks successfully enough that I shouldn't say nobody, there's a large number of members of Congress that don't want to do it. The House Republican majority has now said that they won't do any earmarks. The question then becomes, well, what are they? It's not just the project where a member of Congress is able to get some funding for the Army Corps of Engineers to do a flood control project on a particular river, or Senator Cardin last year was able to get some money for the Chesapeake Bay Trust to do a green jobs program, to educate kids into various green jobs, put them out into a lot of your kinds of organizations where they can be able to learn the craft of being, they're involved with these green jobs. So those kinds of efforts are what many would call typical earmarks. They're inserted at the request of a particular member of Congress, they're to a particular organization, and they're geographically limited. However, some people like Senator Coburn have argued that just about everything is an earmark, in his view. If it's not national funding for a national program that's authorized, then in his view it's an earmark. And, for example, he argues that the Chesapeake Bay program is an earmark. It is an authorized program in the Clean Water Act, Section 117. It is run by EPA, but he says, no, it's not a national program, it's a regional program, therefore it's an earmark. It's for one particular place in the country, it's not for everybody. Or the same thing with the NOAA Chesapeake Bay Program Office, or any number of other federally authorized projects for particular places. Poplar Island restoration in the Army Corps of Engineers project to restore Poplar Island in the Chesapeake, earmark project can't do it. Funding for the Assateague National Seashore Beach Restoration Project, earmark can't do it. Josh says that, according to some people, that what constitutes an earmark is if it's not in the president's budget. Now, the president will occasionally, obviously for programs like the Chesapeake or the Great Lakes or so on, has line items in the budget that say, yes, I want to fund the Chesapeake Bay program, EPA's Chesapeake Bay program at $35 million or $50 million for the coming year. Coburn argues that that's an earmark. The president also in the Corps of Engineers budget will say, we have a system of federal navigation channels throughout the country, including up through the network of the Chesapeake Bay, up the Nanticoke River, for example, that there is federal dredging that should occur in the Nanticoke River to keep the mouth of the river open for navigation purposes. So Senator Coburn says that's an earmark. Doesn't matter whether it's the president's budget or not. It's a particular place. It only benefits a limited number of United States citizens. Therefore, it's an earmark. There's no agreement among the appropriators about what constitutes an earmark. Senator Mikulski says, and she's the chair of the Commerce, Science, Commerce, Justice, Science subcommittee on appropriations in the Senate. She says, look, if it's money going to EPA for the Chesapeake Bay program, that's not an earmark. In her world, in CJS, she says the money that goes to NOAA to operate the Chesapeake Bay program, or the Oxford Lab, or oyster restoration programs, those aren't earmarks. That's what federal government does. She also says that, you know, if Senator Cardin comes and asks for additional funding for NOAA to do something at the Oxford Lab, or asks for NOAA to do more than the president asked for in its oyster restoration program, she doesn't count that as an earmark either. She says that's federal government spending federal government according to the rules. Not all committees agree with that. One of the other appropriations committees that Josh talked about there, Energy and Water, which has oversight for the Corps of Engineers budget, says the president, when he puts in his budget, it's very detailed in many ways. It'll have the Nanticoke River Dredging Project as a specific project that's listed in there. The Energy and Water Committee says, yes, that's an earmark, that's a presidential earmark, and the members can add to that. So all of this is meant to confuse you, and I hope I've done so.
And
Can we give up the next slide?
Yeah, real quick, what happens to overall funding levels if earmarks are stripped out?
They stay the same. Originally people thought of earmarks as, way back in the day, back when Peter was on the House side, earmarks were add-ons. So if there was, $500 million for the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund that funds sewer treatment plants around the country, there was $500 million in there, and Senator Jennings Randolph wanted to get more money for a sewage treatment plant. He would have said, okay, and I'm going to add onto that $500 million another $1 million for this wastewater treatment plant that we're going to get done. That was earmarks; those were congressional add-ons. Since then, that's changed so that the top number stays the same. It's still $500 million, but you say out of that $500 million, $1 million is going to go for these earmarks. So the dollar figure doesn't change. It's just where that funding gets directed really becomes the subject for those earmarks.
NPR has been reporting that if earmarks are officially done away with, we'll just go to the quote phone mark system, where these things get happen with a phone call, and there's no paper trail at all for
Right.
reimbursed.
Right.
So do you just see that as a possible way around this, or?
Possibly. The agencies and departments have done actually a pretty good job of insulating themselves from phone marks. That they get their money, like at the Chesapeake Bay program. Most of the money that goes, $50 million that goes to Chesapeake Bay program, doesn't stay with the EPA. Almost all of it goes back out the door. It goes out to the states for their implementation grants. It goes out to the universities for their monitoring programs. It goes out for a bunch of different purposes. The small watershed grants program that a lot of you have participated in, that NIFWIF coordinates. That money goes to the National Fish and Wildlife Federation, and then they combine it with other federal funds that are out there, and they're able to put those dollars out into these small watershed projects throughout the Chesapeake. Those processes are all organized by peer review panels that look at all the applications that come in. They make their recommendations. They get done. The only time I think you really see any influence occurring there at all is if the decision maker, so the Jim Edwards at the Bay Program office, is making a final determination about where does a grant go, and it's really 50-50. He doesn't, both applications were equally rated. They're both very strongly supported. If Jim Edwards, and he's probably the only one that's going to see this letter from a member of Congress or get a phone call saying, the James River Association does great work and they should be the ones that you turn to now for this one. That might make a difference. But the people are actually evaluating all those grants and stuff, they never see those letters. They never get the phone calls. So I think it's unlikely to have much of an influence really on.
So a phone mark is not legally binding.
No.
A law is, and an appropriations bill is.
That's right. That's right. So having said that, what we've tried to do in the past is look at all of the different appropriations bills and said, the Chesapeake Bay is a big place, and the restoration effort is a complicated thing, and it has innumerable components, and for that reason, we should be looking in a lot of different places for how do we fund that restoration. Where does the federal contribution come from? And it doesn't go all to EPA through the Interior and Environment bill. This is almost impossible to see, but that serves my purpose. I work in the Senate. So on the top line is Environmental Protection Agency. This is a thing that the folks at the Northeast Midwest Institute typically did for the House members in years gone by. So Chesapeake Bay program in FY10, $50 million. President's request for FY11, $63 million. Okay, and then they would track it out from there. How much did the task force ask for? How much did the House actually do? What did the Senate do? What finally ends up being the last number there? So that's Chesapeake Bay program, part of EPA. Then you look down at the next one. What about the Small Watershed Grants program? Does that get a separate allocation of money? Is there an earmark for that? Targeted watershed grants, those are the large watershed grants, or sort of the legacy grant stuff that was done. The Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund, and so on. And then within NOAA's budget, what are the opportunities within NOAA's budget to try to help support the restoration effort? The studies that are conducted out of either the Annapolis office or the Oxford lab, the Chesapeake Bay oyster restoration, the BWET grants program, the trawl survey, the blue crab survey, and so on, down the line. And what Charlie Steck sort of perfected during his years with Senator Sarbanes was, how do we look down through the federal budget and look for where do all the federal agencies have a nexus of activities that relate to the Chesapeake. So you can say, U.S. Geological Survey, where do they fit in terms of their monitoring programs and so on. And in the Department of Interior, the forestry program is funded out of the USDA, believe it or not. Back in the day when they first started organizing this stuff, forests were viewed basically as a commodity. It's timber. We have a slightly different view of forests these days, I think. Corps of Engineers, what are the opportunities? U.S. Department of Agriculture, where can we provide support for conservation programs on the agricultural programs and research, and so on down the line. In the financial services budget, which Josh did not have in blue, but I shouldn't have ratted you out on that, I guess, because you can't tell anyway.
I thought it wasn't blue.
Oh, I couldn't tell. It was in blue.
We'll go
Josh
back
is
and look at
brilliant.
it later.
And the DC's budget is done through the financial services, and there's an opportunity for us to try to put some extra federal funds into the enhanced nutrient removal at Blue Plains. So there's a bunch of different opportunities there, and we've tried to negotiate and navigate that process to make sure that those funds sort of end up where they need to go. Okay, so now the process is broken. What do we do? How do you sort of replicate this thing into the future? I think the typical ability of doing earmarks that are going to go to a nonprofit organization, a university system, even probably like a county government, is probably not going to happen in the next 2 years. I think the House is effectively going to be able to shut that down. So what do? I think what we do is we work hard on all of these federal agencies to try to figure out how best do we provide support to them, and through the funding process, through the appropriations process, to make sure that that EPA budget for the Chesapeake Bay program is robust enough to support the Small Watershed Grants program, which is an authorized program. and that they should be able to fund it right out of their EPA program office funds. Or that USDA, through the NRCS program, the Natural Resource Conservation Services programs, has sufficient funding to support the conservation programs that are out there. Or the Agricultural Research Service at Burke has, at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, the flagship for agricultural research in the country, that they have sufficient funds to fund additional agricultural innovation projects and research to know what works. So those are the opportunities that we have to look at. Same thing, but there's a step removed. What we have to do is work with the appropriators, work with the government agencies that pursue those programs, and make sure that within those line items that they are supporting the things that we say are the priorities for the Chesapeake. We have two big advantages. Number one is President Obama's executive order on the Chesapeake Bay. He has made an administration-wide commitment that they are going to help with the restoration activities, and they're going to do it exactly in this way across all sectors of the federal government, executive branch. So we need to be able to make sure that the appropriators, the Congress, provides the funds to the federal agencies and continue to work directly with the federal agencies to make sure that those funds are expended in ways that support the Chesapeake executive order. The second advantage we have is sort of the flip side of the same coin. We have an administration now that is friendly to the Chesapeake and the restoration effort written large. And I think we need to continue to take advantage over the course of the next couple of years to make sure that those federal agencies are keenly aware of the importance of the projects that we're doing, putting those things on the ground and making sure that that helps. There's when we are looking at appropriations, and we think that the state revolving loan fund as a way of helping support communities with their wastewater treatment plant upgrades that are going to happen as part of the restoration activities here, that this line item that goes in the Chesapeake or into the president's budget for the Clean Water SRF, that's an obscure detail. It kind of loses its sexiness to a lot of people because it's not Blue Plains, or it's not the Patuxent wastewater facility, or Back River, or any of the other particular facilities you can point to. But it's important. That's how Blue Plains and Patuxent and Back River will get their money. So we need to make sure that those big pots of money are full, that they're robust as we can. The general slide that Josh talked about very early, about how small the amount of discretionary spending that goes into these kinds of programs is hugely important. Making a difference at that level can make an enormous difference about how much funding. If you can go from 2.5% to 3% of the federal government spending, some respects seems kind of modest, and then you think about, well, a 0.5% increase when you're only at 2.5 to start with is pretty significant. So there's opportunities there, I think, in terms of big picture, and then making sure you follow through with each one of the individual agencies as we go on, and then working with the program offices at each one of those to make sure that those are being done well. For things like the Small Watershed Grants Program, making sure that you're doing great projects is key, that they get funded, and they're great in the community. Communities love them. We need to make sure that more than the community knows about them. You have to make, PR part of your efforts whenever you're doing any of these activities. It's got to be stuff that's sold to the local media, it's got to be sold to the local community, and it's got to be sold back to your members of Congress and senators that these programs work and that you're keen on making sure that they continue to get funded. Same thing with wastewater treatment plants, real basics, infrastructure for the United States tends to be ignored. We get literally tens of thousands of letters and phone calls and emails in the Senate, in Senator Cardin's office every week. I bet you we haven't had more than 10 about wastewater treatment plants. People take it for granted, and you can't anymore. We are in a pitched battle here, I think, over the course of the next 2 years to make sure that environmental priorities are recognized in the budget process, are implemented appropriately, and that people are taking deserved credit for the good work that gets done. And it's only if we are sort of able to do that, I think, that you're going to be able to be successful here. Because otherwise, we'll be looking at some very significant reductions, I think, in our ability to push the restoration effort forward with federal funding help. Anyway, that's the end of my pitch.
Well, let's put this in perspective for people a little bit, Mike. Mike's put up here a chart with many of the appropriations that impact the Chesapeake Bay. So all told, if we look at all the programs that impact Chesapeake Bay specifically, and national programs of which we draw a piece, out of the $3.6, $3.7 trillion federal budget, how much are we pulling each year to benefit the Chesapeake Bay?
It depends a little bit on how you slice it. Agricultural conservation dollars that go out in the Chesapeake, are you talking just those that are things that we added on, like in the Farm Bill, we were successful in getting this mandatory spending and stuff, or are you only looking at the individual, earmarks we've done? But you're talking probably about a few $100 million Chesapeake-wide, government-wide, for all these operations. EPA, Corps of Engineers, NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, straight on down the line. And I'm including in that not like the general operations for the national parks, like at Antietam or whatever, but I would include in that for the Park Service things like the Gateways and Water Trails program, things that are Chesapeake specific.
So to put that in perspective, we're seeing these whips now from each of the states, and we know that our cost of just compliance with the pollution reduction is in the many, many billions of dollars. And as Mike told you, we're getting somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million annually from the federal government. And of that, a portion of it doesn't benefit pollution reduction. Some of it benefits other things that are certainly worthwhile, but they're not helping us get at that main goal. So point here is we're not getting there. This is great, and $300 million might sound like a lot, but it's really not enough. And another question I want to ask you, Mike, is in this year where we know we're going to see budget cuts and things, and we have a room full of advocates who are hopefully going to leave this room jazzed and go out and help us get more money for Chesapeake Bay restoration. Which of the programs up here on the wall are programs that give us a lot of bang for the buck? Where are places where you would say, advocates, this is where we want to really work to increase the number, and this is one, well, you don't have to tell us what you want to cut, but focus on things that really are going to help us the most. Where should we put our effort?
Yeah, well, I think some of it is defensive, so we need to be sure that we're protecting the EPA Chesapeake Bay Program Office, the NOAA Program Office. Those are the two biggest offices that have sort of overall responsibility for restoration programs. And the biggest dollar figures that are coming out through the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. So those are some of the key elements.
Does everyone know what Clean Water State Revolving Fund is and what it does?
The feds take a pretty sizable chunk of money, about $1 billion a year in recent years, and they give it out to the states according to a formula. And so in Maryland, they get about 4.25% of that. Then MDE uses that money, and they can loan it out to any one of the wastewater treatment facilities in the state at a very low or no interest rate for them to be able to do their work. And then as they get repaid, they keep this corpus of money available that they can use as a revolving loan fund to support those activities. And because you're charging below interest rates, below what they can get on the bond market even, this is an attractive alternative for wastewater treatment plants to be able to turn to. So that's one of them, and a key element, because it is, it's $100 million or more for Maryland last year when we did the recovery
been at $1 billion for, in my memory, for a long time. And my second question is, what are the prospects and how do you recommend that we advocate for actually getting real money from the SRF for local stormwater programs?
Yeah, that's great. You know, I think that under the best case scenario, we'll hold our own on SRF funding. That if we can keep that revolving at $1 billion annually, that will be a big victory. That's a big number in EPA's budget, and it is one that is when appropriators need to get down, get their budget numbers down some, that's going to be a pretty easy target to say, well, you know, it's already $1 billion. If we do $900 million, that's pretty close, and we've saved $100 million there that we can use for something else, or just deficit reduction. So I think keeping that at where it's at is probably the realistic effort, and it will be a big battle to do that. Now, in terms of about using it for basically stormwater and green infrastructure programs and stuff, Senator Cardin has been a big advocate for this. We were able to first do it in the Recovery Act funding, where we clarified that these funds could be used, in fact had to be used, 20% of them had to be used for green infrastructure in both the drinking water side and on the wastewater side. And in the drinking water side, that's going to be probably a little bit problematic about whether we can keep it, because it was pretty much ended up being mostly around source water protection programs, which were fine. You can't do land conservation program with that, so there's limitations on how much you can do there. But on the wastewater side, it can be used for stormwater. It's an eligible activity, and it can be used for green infrastructure. So a lot of the things like, what's green infrastructure? Who does that sort of work here in the group? Diane?
Green, you're looking for a definition?
Yeah.
Green infrastructure is practices that use natural methods, and particularly vegetation, anything from single tree to grove to urban forests, to other methods that, like permeable pavement, that enable stormwater to sink down into the ground or to be filtered through natural soils and vegetation. So it's basically using Mother Nature to capture rainwater at the source and reuse it.
Right. So what you're looking at is just trying to figure out how do you mimic natural hydrology for a site, and it's all these techniques. Put as much Mother Nature back in place as will allow, and you can augment that with these, rain gardens and a bunch of other techniques that can be used. These are generally small-scale projects that manage to have very big impacts, very large reductions in the amount of pollutants that would otherwise be coming from stormwater areas. You're talking on the order of 90% or more effectiveness in removing metals from a runoff, for example, and pretty big numbers in terms of sediment and nutrients and so on throughout that process. So those 20% of the funds now, when we did it in the Recovery Act, and then when we did it for the appropriations bill last year, and we'll do it again for the appropriations bill this year, I think is specifying that the funds can be used, and in fact 20% of them have to be used for green infrastructure. And that doesn't mean that it has to be used for stormwater, but I think effectively it ends up meaning that it will be used for stormwater. Bonnie?
Is any part of that for retention of the green infrastructure instead of
No.
restoring?
No, unfortunately. John?
Given the hundreds of millions of dollars disparity between need and funding, do you think the ultimate solution is kind of trust funds? And if so, what kind of liability does that have?
Yeah, Senator Cardin was the chief sponsor of the Water Infrastructure Financing Act in the last Congress that would have dramatically increased the authority for funding in the state revolving loan fund, would have added these components permanently about how much you could use for green infrastructure, It would allow the states to use a significant portion of those as grant funds for low-income communities instead of just as loans and so on. So there were a whole pile of reforms that we had worked hard with a lot of the folks in this room on trying to get implemented into that legislation. And we had bipartisan support for it. Came out of our committee with broad bipartisan support in terms of the bill that we were introducing. Got hung up on the funding formulas that are used and a bunch of other reasons, but I think that approach probably won't work. And that John's right, that the disparity between what we're doing and what needs to be done is so great and growing, and as I indicated in the question from Diane there, that it's likely to continue to grow, that there's a desire to sort of take time out and say, is there a different way to do this? Some people are advocates of privatizing some of these facilities, and you sell your asset to American Water Works and they run the programs and stuff. Senator Cardin is not a fan of that and thinks it's not generally a good approach. There are other approaches that have to do with establishing trust funds that the federal government would put these dollars in and would be able to use to leverage bonds, federal bonds kind of thing, that, for communities to be able to use for support. So you're just like a local community or state government is able to use bonding ability to support a broader range of money because you're paying it back over the lifetime of that asset, 20 years or 30 years or 40 years even. So those are some of the things I think that are likely to be considered and likely, potentially to have some success because of the fact that I think people recognize on both sides of the aisle, and infrastructure in the past has not been a partisan issue. We still have a bunch of knuckleheads that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but there are a bunch of people I think that are willing to work with us on trying to figure out new ways to do those kinds of financing.
Back to earmarks for a second. Those of us who do this every year, we ask for, I don't know if you call them earmarks, some of them are earmarks, some are, just that's directed spending in some sense. We go meet with you and other people in the delegation and say, here are these projects, our biggest priorities on this booster funding. Is that something, is that all changed now? Are we wasting our time coming and lobbying on those things? And that's the first part of my question. What's the most useful thing for us to do? Because we're also talking administration. But the second part is there's been a process on the Hill in terms of these forms Josh alluded to, sort of to get to develop a list and be transparent about the earmarks. Given the no earmark thing, is that process going to go forward this year?
But before Mike says anything, I want to just say, as an advocate, the point you make is not that this is harder and we should try less, but it's in fact the opposite. It's we need you more than ever. We need you to be bothering your members of Congress more than ever. And I jumped on Mike's toes because I know that he can't be as rah-rah about this, or, he works for the Congress. But we should be bothering Mike more. If you all haven't called Mike this week, you should.
Maybe Mike has a different view on that, but...
I mean, of course, the point isn't to bother Mike, but the point is the harder it gets, the more needed advocates are. The more we need to work, and the more we need everyone in this room to join this fight.
Can I just clarify, because I feel like you might have misunderstood my question.
Yeah.
Which is not that we fold our hands and go away, but is it useful to do a different kind of lobbying than going for those particular earmarks, maybe higher up the line, for the larger program? Or is there a way we should do it differently, not less, but differently?
Yeah. And I think the answer is yes. Senator Mikulski and Senator Cardin are not going to be having people fill out forms this year. That's a thing of the past, at least for the time being. I think you're right. What we sacrifice in this sort of new era is transparency. And all the things that were really helpful reforms are going to go out the window, and then everything is going to be, sort of not as transparent. Senator Cardin puts up on his website under the heading on the front page, earmarks for Maryland. You know, he's proud of this. These are fine projects. He's willing to stand behind them. These are great things. Anybody who's not in favor of more efforts to restore oysters in the Chesapeake Bay is, you know, they fit in my knucklehead category. You know, this is a good use of federal dollars. There's no doubt about it. Cardin's a strong proponent, willing to have that argument with anybody. That goes away. So what we will have instead, I think, is these opportunities for us to talk with the community about how do we continue to make sure that that priority doesn't get lost. And so we talk with you, we look at the two traditional mechanisms we've used for that in the past, the Army Corps of Engineers and the NOAA budgets, as ways of trying to get funding out there for these oyster restoration efforts. And we should continue to do that and look for opportunities about that. It becomes much more difficult with the Corps of Engineers. They don't have a specific authority that says that they should be doing oyster restoration. They do have an ecological restoration directive, and we think we can work under that on oysters. You know, with NOAA, it's a little different. They both have the fishery, the oyster fishery is under their jurisdiction, and the ecological restoration activities.
Just before Mike takes this next question, even though Senator Cardin and Mikulski will not be doing request forms, other members in our delegation will. The Virginians ask that their request forms be in by the end of February. Pennsylvania is the same. So remember, everyone is different, and what you'll need to do if you want to engage in this is call the offices. I mean, that's where everything starts.
Yeah. And I think you need to think too about, recognize what the new world order is out there. That in the House, you know, the Republicans control the turf over there, and they've said we're not doing any earmarks. So what you have to do is figure out what activities you support, how does that funding flow through, and how do you do it in a way that's not an earmark. So like I said, you know, if you're providing money to some of these national programs or regional programs that are at the federal government's authorization to do this, they already have grant-making ability, they already have an ability to do a lot of the things that you want them to do, but you just have to sort of pull your request back up from, it should come to, you know, the Mattawoman Watershed Association. Instead, we should be looking back, you know, one step from that at, you know, EPA or Fish and Wildlife Service or whoever the appropriate people are that needs to have that sort of financial contribution. One other thing, let me shoot this in here quickly before we run in time crunch here. Josh asked about what are the key priority areas we should focus on. Well, I think this is right on appropriations, but as Josh said, federal money comes in a couple of different forms. There's entitlement programs, you know, as my gray hair indicates, I'm getting closer to the Social Security thing myself, so I'm happy about that. And those are a big part of the federal government spending. There are also these mandatory spending programs, and there's really only two of them in all the federal government of any significance, and they're both really important to this community. One of them is the Highway Trust Fund programs. The Surface Transportation Bill has a lot of directed spending in it. And I think we're due for reauthorization of the Surface Transportation law. I'm not positive that that's going to happen this year with the way the Congress is off the rails, but an opportunity there for making sure that directed spending ends up in the right pots, like mass transit, and not into, you know, new highways that are unneeded, or that we're making sure that stormwater control is integrated into all federal aid highway projects as a part of their function. So those kinds of things, surface transportation. Second one is, and that money is real money and it goes out the door, as Josh says, unless it gets stopped. The second one is the Farm Bill, where huge amounts of money go out the door, mandatory spending. The Commodity Credit Corporation gets these funds. They're directed to spend them. The money has to be there. To make sure that the conservation programs within the Farm Bill are appropriately funded and not, you know, yet another subsidy for agribusiness that's making, you know, $750,000 a pop annually on, you know, from federal sources, that's a good use of time. Those priorities, transportation and farm bill, will be key things, and those are money bills. They're not just policy bills, they're big money bills, and we should be paying attention to those as well as these appropriations issues here. Yes, sir.
Is the American Treasure landscape exercise, think that's useful for Chesapeake?
I hope so. I think it's been a little bit of a disappointment so far, but it's perfect for the Chesapeake. You know, this is an extraordinary place. We should be looking at additional opportunities to provide federal dollars to support those landscapes. And, you know, Senator Cardin in this past year was able to get an extra $2 million for the Blackwater Refuge, and we are looking at opportunities. We had a funding request through the Interior Department this year that would have had another acquisition at Blackwater, plus an acquisition for the National Park Service under the treasured landscapes in order to protect additional landscape in the Chesapeake region. There are, I think, through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, another big key priority, I think, for the community here, is the mechanism that funds a lot of these activities, and that would be key to make sure that that pot of money is sufficiently large that we can support these kinds of programs. Or the Park Service has an acquisitions fund. The Fish and Wildlife Service has an acquisition fund. You know, they bring in some of their own money to match with these other programs. NOAA has a program as well, that a land or a place acquisition thing. Senator Cardin's working with NOAA now to do a national sanctuary at Mallows Bay down in Charles County that would protect that area forever as a national marine sanctuary. There are other opportunities, I think, that are out there. We just need to be, you know, a little shift in the mindset rather than thinking about a particular dollar for a particular organization to do a particular thing. To think about, make sure we've got the right pots of money, and then let those good opportunities sort of be able to have the funding that's there.
I think we have about 10 minutes before. I want to keep taking questions, but there's one other point I want to make before we have to leave. I want to make sure we have time, so bear with me for 1 second. Appropriations bills can do two things, and the one we've been talking about all day is they push money out the door. But something else that can be done through the appropriations process is stopping money from going out the door. We call those appropriations riders. We've seen those used in recent years to block environmental regulation. What they will do is they will say, we are going to add a provision to this bill that says no money can be spent to